This video is sponsored by World Anvil. I've got a long-running video series on my channel where I guide you through the many different ways to create an RPG character. And today we're going to discuss what it's like to create a character in the new version of a game. Because there's a new edition of Dungeons & Dragons out now, and I thought it would be fun to go through the process of making a new character. And I know everybody else already made their videos about the new Player's Handbook like 6 months ago, but I was busy. So I'm doing it now. If you want to help support this channel, consider signing up for my newsletter. I'm planning on using that as the primary way to keep you up to date with the big stuff, especially since social media is such a disaster these days. The link for my newsletter is in the description below, so go check it out. Now on with the show. For the longest time, whenever I would pick up a new TTRPG, I would almost always start by creating a fighter or something similar, whatever the equivalent was. I just thought it was a lot easier to get a handle on a new game system by playing the baseline class, basically the simplest type of character. That way I could get a better handle on the system itself, and then later I could fold in more complexity as I got more familiar with the game. Let's start by just figuring out how attacks work, and then we'll figure out how the magic system works after that. However, over the past few years, when I've played fighters in D&D, I've just gotten bored so much faster. My favorite part of playing a rune knight was when I had cool runes that I could use, kind of like spells to affect the other players, or affect my attacks. But once those were used up, I just felt the game was getting dull, because at that point all I could do was swing my sword a couple of times, and that was kind of it. This doesn't mean that I'll never consider playing a fighter again, but it does mean that I'm definitely a lot more open to other classes, especially since I just love playing spellcasters. For that reason, when I first played Pathfinder, I created a sorcerer. And you know what? It wasn't nearly as daunting as I expected to play a spellcaster in a new game system. And of course, this new version of D&D isn't even all that different from the version of 5th edition that I've played for the past 10 years. I'm not really starting from square one because I already understand D&D's action economy and its magic system. So rather than just defaulting to the most basic class and creating a fighter, I actually sat down with the new Player's Handbook and read through it to see what character options might jump out to me. So let's see if we can create a D&D character who isn't another human wizard like I almost always want to make. Now, as we begin creating a character, the book tells us to start by choosing our class. So I read through the new classes to see what struck a chord with me. And I should say right off the bat, I don't worry too much about balance or which subclass is better than the others or anything like that. Quite frankly, I don't think about mechanics with so much depth or detail that I can tell if something is unbalanced just by reading it on the page. And besides, plenty of other people have already made videos detailing their thoughts about the balance of the latest edition of D&D, so I'll defer to their expertise. Maybe I'll have some more thoughts after playing the system for a while, but right now, I'm just not worried about what's balanced or which classes and subclasses are overpowered or underpowered or anything like that. So since I'm not worrying about that, and since this game system isn't really that different from the last one, when I'm reading these classes and subclasses, I'm focusing mostly on flavor text, artwork, and whatever strikes me as new or different from what I've seen before, especially the new subclasses that weren't in the previous version of the game. And really, I'm just looking for anything that could inspire me. Now, when I got to the Druid section, I liked the new piece of art. It reminds me of Keyleth, but as a man. But I also thought about how so many Druids have such similar aesthetics. Unlike a lot of other classes, a lot of Druids all dress kind of the same. They're all a little bit dressed like Poison Ivy. And I started thinking about what other designs you could come up with for a Druid so they wouldn't necessarily have that same vibe. And I got hit with an idea for a Druid who was dressed more like a knight. Like maybe a character with a wooden helmet carved with antlers on top, and where the front looks a little bit like Gothi's mask from Fool's Gold. Okay, admittedly, wooden helmet with horns still isn't that different from the traditional Druid aesthetics. But I always like a good masked character. I've wanted to play some sort of masked D&D character for a few years now. And while I think I could come up with a badass Druid based on that mental image, this really doesn't have anything to do with the new system, does it? And besides, it turns out that I would get my mask itch scratched once I reached the monk and read the opening paragraph for the Warrior of Mercy subclass. Warriors of Mercy manipulate the life force of others. These monks are wandering physicians, but they bring a swift end to their enemies. They often wear masks, presenting themselves as faceless bringers of life and death. Ooh, I love a good excuse to put a D&D character behind a mask, and this is definitely a good excuse for that. Plus, Warriors of Mercy can use their unarmed strikes to do extra necrotic damage or to heal someone. Obviously, this is probably inspired by martial arts movies or tropes of someone having a powerful death touch as well as being able to heal by hitting you in the right spots. But it actually reminds me of the X-Men character Elixir, who basically has a golden healing touch as well as a death touch. Now, I didn't really have an idea for this character, but I like the idea of playing a masked figure who doles out death and healing in equal measure. In fact, I've wanted to play a D&D character called The Judge. That was going to be a wizard. It's a really specific character that I've wanted to play for a while now, but I could potentially steal that name for a monk. Or I could give him the Judge title and then a surname, kind of like Judge Dredd, I guess, another master judge who dishes out death. But he could basically be a part of this order that consider themselves above the reproach of anybody else, and they think their members are worthy to judge others. So you have these judges wandering the world dealing out justice, kind of like the Jedi if we want to evoke a concept that is at least slightly less fascist than Judge Dredd. Or here's an idea I thought of while I was writing the script. Instead of judges, his title could be juror, and they're each numbered, so it's like juror number 10 or something like that. And in fact, maybe there are only 12 of them in total, and whenever one of them dies or retires, a new juror, one of the acolytes known as alternates, is appointed to take their place. And here, my gentle viewer, is where I run into a problem. Because when I read through the book, I liked the monk, but then I got to the clockwork sorcerer, and I really like the flavor they suggest, where you can potentially hear a ticking clock when you cast their spells. And then I struggled to figure out the best way to execute that character, because the clockwork sorcerer is in tune with the mechanics of the universe, but that's a concept that never really made a ton of sense to me. I figured if you're going to do a clock-themed character, let's give him some time magic, make him a time wizard, basically, while still limiting ourselves to using this book and not dusting off the rules for dunamancy. And the divination wizard is the closest option in the new player's handbook to a time wizard. But I thought, well, you can probably reskin the clockwork sorcerer to be more of a time-themed character, just give them some more divination spells. But looking at the sorcerer spell list, they don't really get that many divination spells, at least not for the kind that would work for a time-themed character. So I started really wrestling with whether to play a clockwork sorcerer or a divination wizard, and I chased that thread for a while, and I couldn't decide until I rolled for a trinket and I got the knife of a relative. And I thought instead of that knife being a gift or an heirloom, the character was betrayed by his brother and left for dead with this knife sticking out of him, kind of like what happens to Selina Kyle at the beginning of Batman Returns. Only instead of being licked back to life by cats, this character had a near-death experience where he saw the clockwork movements of the universe and realized he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that there is always a right place and a right time. And now he's obsessed with order and organization, kind of like, to keep it in the Batman family, kind of like the Clock King or Two-Face, but if instead of embracing randomness and chance, he devoted his life to controlling chaos. And I could use footage from Stranger Than Fiction to demonstrate how this character sees the world, and even use a clip from the much-maligned film Batman and Robin to explain his worldview. There's a genuinely great scene that captures this so well. You were going to be really impressed by that. And of course, this character would be true neutral, so we were going to talk about the challenges of playing a true neutral character, and what sort of steps I would take to make sure he wasn't insufferable to play with. And I would draw from a recent experience that I had where I played a true neutral character in a Spelljammer game, and I would say it was a probably negative experience for the other players, and that's something I would have to address in the future with this character. And it was going to be a pretty good video, if I do say so myself. But now, that character is gone. Forget about him. Because like I said, while writing the script, I got to the section about the Warrior of Mercy monk, and I came up with this juror idea, and I really like it. So that's what we're doing today. Because now I'm just imagining all this fun world building with this order of jurors. They call themselves the jury, or maybe justice or something like that. I actually do like justice because people could say justice is coming, and that could be a warning that one of the jurors is coming to town. But I'm actually going to stick with the jury because it's cool and ominous, and also just clearer and easier to understand what we're talking about than justice. And the leader of their order is called the judge. He's the one who sets forth commands, and maybe even sometimes sends the jurors out on specific tasks. But otherwise, they're free to wander and find their own cases and essentially try them themselves. But of course, typically, jurors aren't detectives in regular courtrooms. Their job is not to track down evidence or make arguments in defense of anyone. They're just supposed to collect the data provided by the prosecution and defense in a case, and then weigh them and figure out who made the better argument. But the jurors do act like detectives in one of my favorite films of all time, 12 Angry Men. From what I've heard, lawyers literally talk about this movie as the worst case scenario for how a jury behaves in court, because jurors are absolutely not supposed to do anything they do in this film. They are not supposed to behave like detectives or prosecutors or defense attorneys. But this movie is also flawless, so I've got no complaints. Including the jury as a faction in my backstory would also be such a gift to the GM. It's a great piece of world building, but it's also not too invasive. I didn't create a whole town or a kingdom or anything like that. I created basically 12 NPCs and a home base somewhere. But that could be anything from a monastery in the mountains like in Batman Begins, to an unassuming building in a port town, to an ominous tower in the heart of the capital city. That's maybe up to the GM to decide. Plus, now my GM has these other members of the jury that we could also cross paths with, potentially. And they might not all be the most upstanding members of society. I don't know if they're all the best dudes. Drawing on the Jedi comparison, you can still have corrupt or flawed members of that organization, like we saw in the Clone Wars or the Acolyte. And even if there is some sort of purity test to make sure they're not horrible people, They could still be assholes. The Green Lantern Corps looks for worthy people to become Green Lanterns, but we still got Sinestro, a corrupt villain, and Guy Gardner, a conceited douchebag. The very premise of 12 Angry Men is that jurors can be wildly different people with their own priorities and their own biases. And so maybe my juror and the rest of his D&D party can interact with one or two of the other jurors at different points during the campaign, and they can actually be complex characters. And in fact, maybe the judge sometimes has to call all the jurors back because he needs them all to deliberate on one specific case. And just like in the movie, it has to be unanimous. Ooh, and maybe the way you become a member of the jury is you just receive a summons. Maybe lots of people receive summons and not all of them show up, and some of them do, but they don't pass the muster. Ooh, and also just imagine the puns. The jury's still out. You'll get your day in court. I have to deliberate. Man, this would be such a fun character to play. The truth is, it's a challenge to include world building as part of your character that's distinct and clear enough to give your GM a lot to work with, but also subtle enough that it doesn't completely screw up your GM's homebrew world if it's included. I think the jury threads that needle really well, but there are other ways to do it as well. I mean, your GM could give you a lot more freedom to make declarations about their setting, or even give you the ability to add any details you like, but just to one little corner of the world. And it is easier than ever for your GM to do that if they use today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic online resource that gives your game master a robust toolkit to create articles and timelines for their world. And your GM can actually give you the power to edit certain articles. So if they wanted to say, hey, just write down everything you can think of about the jury, they could do that. And if you just want to play the game digitally, you and your players can actually do that through the website. World Anvil has some really excellent tools for running your game digitally, allowing you to reference all of your world's material digitally through their GM tools. And they don't just support D&D, they have a whole bunch of games you could play through the website. And if you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 51% off of any annual membership. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thanks so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. So now it's time to flesh out some details. I chose my class, and even though we're not a Warrior of Mercy yet at level 1, I can still keep that in mind when building the character. Keep in mind the subclass that I want them to take when they reach level 3. I took the skills Insight and Stealth, since those work really well for a detective-style character. Now, once you've got your class, the book suggests you next choose a background. I was originally going to go with the Acolyte background. Even though I don't think the jury is a religious order, the Acolyte still made sense to me. I could just reskin it so that the character isn't a member of a priestly order. But then I noticed that the Acolyte background gives you some cleric spells with the Magic Initiate feat, and that seems a little strange to me. I just never imagined this character having that sort of magic. Yes, I know I just talked about how I get bored playing fighters who have no magic, but remember, I have a mental image in mind with this character, and it's much more Iron Fist than a cleric. Now, the Hermit background says you could be a member of a monastery, and that's cool. I hardly ever see it used that way. And it gives you a healer's kit, which also works pretty well for this character. But I could get the acrobatics from the Acolyte background, and that would be really nice for a monk. Plus, I realized since I don't get all my cool Warrior of Mercy stuff at level 1, I could use the Acolyte background spells to basically capture some of this character's core fantasy at the early levels by giving him some healing magic. And also, to be fair, I did name drop the TV show The Acolyte when I was talking about Jedi earlier and comparing them to the jury, so I guess it's only fitting. So I took that background, and for his spells, he'll take Spare the Dying to represent the Hand of Healing, and Inflict Wounds to represent the Hand of Harm. And we'll take the cantrip Light because the Warrior of Mercy's hand glows in the dark, and the Iron Fist's hand glows, and so this could be a lot like there could be a lot of Iron Fist in this character, and the Light cantrip helps us do that. And for tools, we'll take a forgery kit because I kind of like the idea that if the juror thinks someone is innocent of some awful crime, they might have to doctor some evidence to get them cleared in the eyes of the law, since the jury doesn't actually have the support of the government. They're a completely extra-legal entity. Or maybe this character had some skills at forgery because they had a criminal background, because fuck it, we're already creating a perfect Mike Christensen character, we might as well lean in and give him a shady past too. Though I'm not committed to that just yet, I'm not sure we'll go that way. So now we have to choose his species, and I kind of like the character essentially being fully black and white, or more accurately, having shades of gray. Not just because it's a reference to the movie, but also because I like the acknowledgement that the juror does understand that a situation might be more complicated than it seems, and so he's prepared to deal with shades of gray. He's prepared to deal with the complicated moral questions of the real world. So between the juror's skin and his clothes, he should be some combination of white, black, and gray. I don't just want to play an albino human, or a halfling, or a dwarf, or an orc, or whatever, so the best species are the ones that actually have white or black or gray as an option for when you're creating the character. So Aasimar, Dragonborn, Elf, Goliath, or Tiefling. Putting a mask on a Dragonborn seems like it might be kind of complicated. I love tieflings, but I just can't see anything about this character that gets elevated by being a tiefling. Same goes for elves. I think they're a lot of fun, but I don't know if they quite line up with how I imagine this character. Maybe because I typically consider elves to be haughty and tieflings to be jaded. I think they both have valid reasons to wander the world and seek justice, but that kind of means that their species pulls a little bit of the focus for this character because I want their membership in the jury to be the only reason why they're wandering the world looking for justice. And I don't want that to be muddied at all by also having them be a tiefling or an elf. Aasimar can work really well, plus they've got healing hands, but once again, it would be nice if all their healing abilities came from their training to be a warrior of mercy. Plus, I just don't get that excited about Aasimar, or about this character specifically being able to turn into an angel at higher levels. Maybe if you were creating this character, that would make perfect sense to you, that would actually fit your idea better, but it just doesn't capture what makes this character cool for me. And so I guess that leaves the Goliath. Well, I'll be honest, I hadn't really pictured the character being taller than an average human, but I can picture it, actually, and yeah, it can still work. Make him tall and lean, actually kind of like Henry Ford in 12 Angry Men. He's quite a tall drink of water. And also, Goliaths have a speed of 35 feet, so he's already faster than most people. And then add to that his unarmored movement to level 2, and he's going to be really cruising across the battlefield. We'll make him related to the stone giants, and his skin can be light gray like stone. And then we can still dress him in black and white and maybe gray. As for stats, this character would really work best if he had high stats in just about everything, or at least more so than we can get with just the standard array. After all, we need a good dexterity and wisdom, and as a martial character, it'd be nice to have a high constitution, and if he's also going to be kind of a detective, it would be nice if he had at least good intelligence. So I'm going to take my chances, and I'm going to try to roll for stats, which is what I did, and sure enough, I got really lucky, and I rolled great stats. With our background bonuses, we can get 17s in dexterity and wisdom, and a 14 intelligence. Combine that with a 15 constitution and strength and charisma that are +0, but no negative modifiers. That's a pretty solid character from Jump Street. Okay, typically we'd come up with a backstory here, but before I do, I'm gonna roll for a random trinket, because it's so much easier to fold the trinket into your backstory if you roll for it first, as I learned from the Clockwork Sorcerer and the Knife. I rolled a 93 and I got an empty wine bottle labeled Wizard of Wine's Winery, Red Dragon Crush, 331422-W. This gives me two ideas. Either my juror was an alcoholic and keeps this bottle around to remind himself that he never needs to take another drink, or he carries the bottle around because the jury's secret headquarters is in a winery. I kind of like that one, actually. After all, monasteries often made wine in their own world, so maybe this monastery is also a winery. Now, I wish the backgrounds in 2024 D&D still came with suggested personality traits, but at the very least, Chapter 2 does include a chart of suggested personality traits by alignment. I imagine this character being lawful good, so I rolled for the good and lawful categories, and I got honest and cooperative. I definitely imagine this character being very honest, possibly even blunt. Not to say that he can never lie or break the law, he's not lawful stupid. Lawful good characters can still lie to get what they want.
Hail Hydra.
And cooperative is a great trait to give him right out of the gate, since this is a team game, and I don't see any benefit in making him a brooding loner. Sure, he tends to work alone, but it's not like a requirement. It's not a mandate from the jury or the judge. He can work with a team if it makes him better at rooting out evil and helping the innocent. Okay, but he does still need some sort of backstory. Who was he before all this? And so I rolled a d16 virtually to see which background might give me the best starting point for his backstory, and I got Soldier. Okay, fair enough. He's a former soldier who came back from the war. We're not using any aspect of that background for the character, it's all strictly narrative, but maybe he came back from war and he had a hard time adjusting. Maybe he actually did struggle a lot. I don't want to fully commit to him being an alcoholic, but I still think he probably was a lost soul, unable to move on because he had no purpose. And he received a summons, and Batman Begins style, he had to travel to the monastery and train and become an acolyte, ultimately becoming an alternate juror. Finally, he got the word. Juror number 7 had died. No, let's actually say he was dismissed, because we don't necessarily know what that means. Maybe he retired, or maybe he died, and that's just how they talk about it, because they never like to talk about when a juror dies in the line of duty. Or maybe he was discharged or fired. And in the latter case, then there could be a rogue juror out there, if the GM wants to go that way. But whatever happened to him, now our hero is the new juror number 7, and he just wanders the world looking for injustices he can correct. And honestly, I would tell my GM, the juror doesn't even really have a lot of attachment to his life before joining the jury. This is who he is now. This is his whole identity. And I think the reason I'm comfortable saying that is because I don't think he's a brutal man who's just out to punish the guilty and he won't give people a fair chance. He's not Judge Dredd. He doesn't have to relearn his humanity by being exposed to who he was before he joined the jury and became corrupted. He's closer to someone like Qui-Gon or Obi-Wan, or even Captain America or Superman. Yes, he serves this higher purpose. He's a member of a specific faction, and the GM can decide whether they are good or bad or neutral or complicated. But this character is interested in nuance. Remember, this subclass is called Warrior of Mercy. He isn't just a judge, jury, and executioner. He's also the defense attorney. He wants to make sure innocent people are protected. From what I understand from the comics, I haven't read them, but based on the impression I get, Judge Dredd doesn't seem to lose a lot of sleep if he kills an innocent person, since a lot of his stories are satires of American and British authoritarianism and over-policing, among other things. But Juror number 7 is out here trying to make sure innocent people are saved whenever possible, which also gives him a good excuse to go on adventures, as long as those adventures have some sort of altruistic justification. So finally, I chose my starting gear. I didn't take the default gear, I just took the gold, and then chose some weapons and gear myself and deducted that cost. I know that a spear would make sense mechanically, but I don't really want one. So instead of 5 daggers, I took 2 daggers and 2 light hammers, like gavels. He could basically throw these hammers at people. And I took the calligrapher and forgery kits, since those are what he's proficient with, and an explorer's pack, and that was it. I didn't want a book of prayers or a holy symbol or parchment or any of that. But yeah, that's my first 2024 D&D character. Man, I really like Juror number 7. I think that would be such a fun character to play. Now I just need somebody to run a game for me so I can play him. I'll run a game for you. I'm okay. I have to admit, as much as I love Juror number 7, part of me is a little bit sad that I didn't get around to creating Otto Osterman, the Clockwork Sorcerer, or even the Time Wizard that I almost made instead. Maybe someday I'll dust off one of those characters. I still really like the idea of playing a D&D character who casts time magic. I think that would be a lot of fun.